right, so my fandom so far this college football season has been like a roller coaster ride. And you're like, here he goes, college football again. Like, I'm actually going somewhere with it, so stay with me this time, all right? Usually I'm just kind of rambling, but this is actually going somewhere. But my fandom has been kind of a roller coaster. My team is the South Carolina Gamecocks, and so coming into the season, I didn't have too high of hopes, but you're always a little hopeful. You're always like, all right, maybe we'll do something this year. Maybe we'll make some noise. So coming into the season 3 weeks ago, our first game, we're playing Old Dominion, like a nobody, a scrub. We should absolutely blow them out. The game comes down to the wire. Like, we barely beat them. We barely hang on and beat Old Dominion. So after that game, I'm like, okay, well, the season's over. We're terrible. We stink. We're not going to win even any conference games in the SEC. Like, it's just going to be a bad season. But I was kind of taking it well. I'm like, but this is kind of a good thing to discover this early, right? Because now I can kind of emotionally detach. Now my emotional health and well-being is not going to be tied to a bunch of 18 and 19-year-old college students for the next 3 months. Like, I know they're going to be bad, so I can just accept that, move on with my life, and my Saturdays are going to be free and clear. I'll have more time on my hands, so things will be good. And then last week, we had a game against Kentucky. Kentucky's not the greatest team, but they're not a bad team. They went toe-to-toe with Georgia, the number 1 team in the country last night, right? So they're pretty decent. So we were playing at Kentucky, at their stadium. We were big underdogs. Like, the betting odds were against us, and we absolutely mopped the floor with Kentucky. Like, we destroyed them. It looked like we were varsity and they were JV. Absolutely wrecked them. So after that game, I'm like, okay. I still don't think we're great. Like, I still don't think, we're like championship contenders, but maybe this season won't be all that bad. Maybe it'll actually be a little bit of fun. And then they announced the night after the Kentucky game, they announced that College Game Day, the big ESPN morning Saturday show, was going to be in Columbia for yesterday's game against LSU. I'm like, cool, College Game Day's coming. Like, maybe we're okay, but I'm still kind of reserved, right? I'm still kind of keeping my emotions in check. I'm like, no, I'm not going to do this. I'm not going on the roller coaster ride again. Like, we're not going to be good, but I'm going to check out this game anyway, just kind of see what happens. So the game starts yesterday. We get the ball. We go and score. Like, okay, that's nice. I'm glad we did that, but still, I know how this is going to go. We're going to lose. Don't get your hopes up, right? Then a few minutes later, we're up 17-0. We're looking dominant. And so then, of course, I can't contain myself. I'm like, oh, we may actually be good. Like, our team may actually be good. Like, this could be the year. Like, we're catching lightning in a bottle. Like, we may go all the way. This is going to be great. And you, of course, know how the story ends, right? Like, our quarterback gets hurt at halftime. Toward the end of the game, the refs just hose us. And I'm not even that guy, right, to blame the refs. But they did. Like, objectively, we got hosed. End up losing, like, a heartbreaking game in the last minute. And so, man, the last 3 weeks, it's been just this, roller coaster of emotion. I'm like, nope, we're terrible. I'm out. I don't care. To, oh, my goodness, no, maybe we're going to do this. I'm all in. Like, let's go. Let's do this. To just back down, and just my soul can't handle the ups and downs. Here's the deal. If you've been walking with Jesus more than 10 minutes, you've experienced that spiritually, right? This, spiritual roller coaster ride where there's moments where you're, on this spiritual high. And you're like, hey, I'm kind of doing it. I'm walking with Jesus. I'm not perfect. I still make mistakes, but hey, man, I'm having my quiet time. I'm forgiving to people. I'm more generous than I was a couple months ago. Man, I even told somebody at work that God loves them. This is great. I feel great. And then, man, doubt starts to creep in, or you blow it, or you give in to temptation, or whatever it is, and you're just back and oh my goodness, I'm the worst Christian in the world. What is wrong with that? That's life sometimes, right? This roller coaster ride of ups and downs. And if you've experienced that, I've experienced that. That's nothing new. We're going to see Peter, one of the first disciples of Jesus, experiencing that exact same thing in the passage we're looking at today. Because where we left off last week, we saw this story where Peter, one of the first disciples, he is on this kind of spiritual high mountaintop experience. If you missed last week, it was this exchange where Jesus brings the disciples in close, and Jesus says, hey guys, I know that everybody out here, they're saying things about me. People say I'm a prophet. Some people say I'm a teacher. They're saying all these things. But hey guys, listen up. I want to know, what do you guys say about me? Jesus asks his disciples, who do you think that I am? Who do you say that I am? And Peter stands up and he makes this profound confession. Peter stands up and says, Jesus, you are the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And this confession that Peter makes, it was such a big deal. It is so huge. It's such a game changer that the other Gospels tell us that when Peter makes this confession, Jesus actually gives him a new name. Peter says, Jesus, you are the Messiah, the Son of God. And Jesus says, hey, your name used to be Simon. That was his old name. He says, your name used to be Simon. Now your name's Peter, which means the rock. Right? Jesus nicknames him the rock. So you can imagine, right? Peter is like riding the spiritual high. He's like, I did it. I nailed it. I got the answer right. I confessed correctly who Jesus was. I was the only one who could see it. No one else stood up and said it. I said it. This is awesome. And Jesus is so pleased with me, he nicknamed me the rock. Like, Peter's got to be feeling pretty good, right? Well, that high is going to last for about 5 seconds, because what we're going to see this morning is immediately right after that, Peter puts his foot in his mouth so badly that Jesus calls him Satan. Right? Like literally in the matter of minutes, Peter goes from making the greatest confession of all time, Jesus saying, hey, Simon's not even good enough. You're now the rock. To Jesus saying, get away from me, Satan. What are you doing? It's like this roller coaster of emotion. Now, to understand what Peter says and why Jesus rebukes what Peter says, we have to first understand what Peter meant when he made this confession that Jesus was the Messiah or the Christ. Messiah and Christ are just two different languages for the same word. So what did Peter mean last week when we saw him say, Jesus, you are the Messiah? You see, all throughout the Old Testament, God had promised, he promised through the prophets that one day he would send this Christ or this Messiah that would deliver God's people. Messiah simply means savior or deliverer. And God's promise of a Messiah was always that this Messiah would deliver God's people from their sin, from evil, from death, and the power of Satan. That's what it was always about. That's what the promise of the Messiah was always looking forward to. The Messiah would come and save people from sin and death and evil. That was the promise. But by the time we get to Jesus' day, there were all sorts of misconceptions among the Hebrew people as to what the Messiah was actually going to accomplish. Because here's what we got to remember historically. The Hebrew people, the Israelites, for so much of their history, they are living under the oppression, under the foot of evil empires. Right? Think back to the Exodus story early on. For generations, they are living as slaves in Egypt under the foot of Pharaoh. They're living under that oppression. Later on, even as they get out of Egypt and get into the Promised Land, you go forward in the story and you see kingdoms like Assyria. You see kingdoms like Babylon rising up, coming in, conquering them, and ruling over them with an iron fist. And so much of the history of the people of God, they are being conquered, they are being ruled over unjustly. And so the people of God, they begin to kind of misunderstand what the Messiah's role would be. Instead of the Messiah being this figure who would ultimately save them spiritually and eternally and save them from their cosmic enemies of sin and death, they started to think the Messiah was going to be kind of this political, military savior who would free them from the oppression of whatever empire happened to be in charge at the time. Right, so that's kind of the mindset of where most of the Hebrew people were. So you get to the days of Jesus, around 30-something AD, and who's in charge? It's Rome, right? Rome is like the preeminent military force on the planet. They've already conquered the majority of the known world at this time. And just like they've conquered everybody else, they've conquered Israel. They've come in, they're occupying their land, they're ruling over them with swords and chariots and levying unfair taxes on them. So, most Israelites who were living around this time period, if you would have asked them, hey, if the Messiah were to show up during your lifetime, if God's promised Messiah was to come today, what would the Messiah do? 99 out of 100 Jews in this day would say, well, if the Messiah shows up today, what the Messiah is going to do is he's going to go to battle against Rome. He's going to lead an army against Rome. He's going to drive Rome out of our land. He's going to conquer Rome, and then he's going to establish the kingdom of Israel where he sits on the throne of his ancestor David. That would have been what any Hebrew person in this day would tell you that the Messiah was going to do. And what we're going to see is that Peter was under that same exact assumption as well. So last week, Peter confesses, he says, Jesus, you're the Messiah, the Son of the living God. And Peter's right. He's correct. Jesus is that. But we're going to see that Peter grossly misunderstands what Jesus has come to do as the Messiah. So Mark 8, pick it up in verse 31. This is just right where we left off last week. It says, then, so right after their confession that he's the Messiah, then Jesus began to tell them, this is the disciples, that the Son of Man, that's a name that Jesus used for himself, so Jesus began to tell them that he must suffer many terrible things and be rejected by the elders and the leading priests and the teachers of religious law. He would be killed, but 3 days later he would rise from the dead. As he talked about this openly with the disciples, Peter took him aside and began to reprimand him for saying such things. So Peter takes him aside and reprimands Jesus. It says, Jesus, though, turned around and looked at his disciples and then reprimanded Peter. Get away from me, Satan, he said. He's saying, Peter, Satan is actually speaking this through you. He said, get away from me, Satan. You are seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's. So we mentioned last week that when Peter makes this confession that Jesus is the Messiah, that kind of serves as the linchpin, that serves as the turning point for the entire book of Mark. Because from that point on in the book of Mark, everything for Jesus is headed towards the cross. Everything from this point on in Mark is preparation for the cross. And so, since Jesus knows the cross is going to be here soon, he brings the disciples in, he gets them together, and he begins to explain what's going to happen to him. That he's going to be betrayed by the religious leaders, that they're going to lie, that they're going to scheme, that they're going to rig this false trial and say a bunch of untrue things about him to have him falsely convicted so that he will be crucified at the hands of the Romans. But then Jesus tells them, but after that I will rise from death. Jesus tells them this, and it says here that he tells them openly or he tells them plainly. So here's the deal. Remember, up till now in Mark's gospel, most of the time, Jesus has been speaking in parables, right? Like kind of some of the messages of what he's saying, they're a little hard to understand. You got to kind of connect some dots and put the pieces together. He's speaking in parables, but it says here now he's speaking openly and plainly. He's telling the disciples exactly what's going to happen to him, and he's not mincing any words. And when Jesus says that he is going to die on a cross at the hands of the Romans, Peter takes him aside and Peter reprimands him. Peter basically says, Jesus, shut up. You cannot talk like that. Can you imagine reprimanding Jesus? Now, before we give Peter too hard of a time, like don't just hear him pick on him, because I think most of us would have too, because remember the mindset, the worldview that Peter is bringing into this conversation. Peter's assumption is that the Messiah is going to be a victorious military king who will drive Rome out of their land. That's who everyone assumes the Messiah is going to be. So, of course, Peter's thinking, hey, no, the Messiah can't die at the hands of Rome. The Messiah must defeat Rome. Jesus, you can't die at the hands of Rome. That's not how this story goes. That's not the plot. Jesus, you've missed something here. Right? Here's kind of what this would be like in our day. This is a crazy, stupid example, but track with me. Imagine if some terrorists kidnapped 3 American citizens somewhere overseas. So terrorists kidnapped 3 American citizens overseas. They release a hostage video, and in this video, they say, hey, you've got 24 hours. We are going to execute these hostages unless the President of the United States turns himself in to us so we can execute him. Now, imagine if the President of the United States were to say, hey, well, there's 3 of them. I'm only one person. Why should 3 have to die instead of 1? I will do this. I will sacrifice myself. I will give myself up to save these lives. Let's do this. If any president said that, what's going to happen next? You know what's going to happen, right? The Joint Chiefs of Staff, all of his advisors, Congress and Senate, they are all going to rebuke the president, rightly. They're not going to let the president do that. They're going to say, no, Mr. or Mrs. President, listen, that's great you want to do that. That's great you're willing to make a sacrifice here, but this isn't about you. This is about the office of the president. The President of the United States is not a sacrificial lamb. Not only does the United States not negotiate with terrorists, but the United States is certainly not giving up the person in the office of the president to die at the hands of terrorists. Right? That's what they say. They would rebuke the president and say, it's not about you, it's about the office. The office is bigger than the person. That's what they would say. That's basically Peter's mindset here. Right? He's like, no, Jesus, you are the Messiah, right? We established that. We figured that out. We all agree. You are the Messiah in being the person who fulfills the office of Messiah. You don't die at the hands of the Romans. That is not part of the job description. So Peter, he rebukes Jesus, says, no, Jesus, that's not happening. And I think another reason why Peter rebukes Jesus is because the way in which Jesus is saying he is going to die. Not only does Jesus say he's going to die, but he's going to die on a cross. See, in this day, dying on a cross was the most dishonorable death you could imagine. Dying on a cross, being executed on a cross, was reserved for the worst of the worst criminals. It was reserved for the lowest of the low in society. If you died on a cross, there was no honor in that at all. It was the most dishonorable way a person could die. In fact, in the Old Testament, it says, cursed is the man who hangs on a cross or who hangs on a tree. There's no honor in dying on a cross. Right, like there's other honorable ways to die, right? Like this week, we all know, is the anniversary of 9/11. And I saw online, I came across this transcript between a 911 operator and this guy, Todd Beamer. He was one of the guys on that flight that crashed into the field in Pennsylvania. And so, man, if you haven't read it, like I would encourage you, like, go home and like Google it and read this transcript. You can't read it without just getting chills and being overcome with emotion. But in this guy, Todd Beamer, he calls 911 from the plane. He says, hey, hijackers have taken control of this plane. He says some other people on the plane, they've called their families, and some of their families are saying that a plane flew into the World Trade Center. Like, is that true? And the 911 operator says, listen, I'm not going to lie to you. Planes flew into both World Trade Centers. The World Trade Centers have collapsed. Another plane flew into the Pentagon. We are under attack, and we believe that the plane you're on is part of that. So they keep talking, they keep having more conversations, and Todd goes off, and then he comes back to the phone, and he says to the operator, he says, listen, me and some of the other passengers, we've talked, and we're not just going to sit by and be pawns and allow more innocent people to die. So they said, we're going to attack the hijackers, and we're going to try to take back control of this plane. And that's exactly what they did, and as we all know, the plane would crash in Pennsylvania in an empty field, killing everybody on board, but saving who knows countless lives on the ground. See, that's terrible. That's tragic, right? But man, like we all agree, and that is an honorable way to die. Like there's no more heroic action that those people could have taken. They died with honor, with dignity. But see, in Jesus' day, somebody who dies on a cross, there's no dignity in that. There is no honor in that. As you are hanging naked, dying a slow death, people are walking by, spitting on you, thinking that you are the worst of society. And so, of course, Peter, who loves Jesus, who cares about Jesus, who has Jesus' best interests at heart, of course, Peter's like, Jesus, no, stop talking like that. We cannot let that happen to you. See, Messiah, a Savior, a King, who would die on a cross, that is not what Peter wanted. But it's exactly what Peter needed. See, because what Peter really needed was not salvation from Rome. That would have only been temporary. What Peter needed, like we all need, is salvation from sin and death, which would be eternal. Peter doesn't know what's best for him. He doesn't know what he needs. He said, Jesus, no, you can't go to the cross. That can't happen to you. And Jesus rebukes him. And Jesus says, Peter, says there in verse 33, you are merely seeing things from a human point of view, not from God's point of view. saying, Peter, God is going to do something through this that you cannot yet see and understand. But here's the deal. I think there's one more reason why Peter is so quick to rebuke Jesus and say, no, Jesus, this can't happen to you. I think it's because Peter's a smart dude, right? We know Peter, like before he was a disciple, he was a fisherman, so he's like, blue-collar, hardworking guy, but like, don't let that fool you. He's also like a super street-smart kind of guy. You can read the letters he wrote in the New Testament. Like, Peter is a pretty brilliant dude. And so what Peter knows is that as followers of the Messiah, as disciples of the Messiah, Peter knows as the Messiah's right-hand guys, he knows what's going to happen to the Messiah is probably going to happen to them. Right? What Peter knows is that if the Messiah goes into Rome and overthrows the emperor and goes and sits on the throne and rules over the palace, if that's what the Messiah does, Peter knows, hey, I'm going to be there in this palace at his right hand. I'm going to be his top advisor and his top general. But on the flip side, Peter's smart enough to realize, well, if you're the Messiah and we're your followers and Rome kills you on a cross, now that doesn't look too promising about what's going to happen for us. Peter's smart enough to put these pieces together. And so Jesus picks up on this, and Jesus basically, he doesn't offer Peter any immediate good news. He actually kind of affirmed that Peter's right on track here, because look at what Jesus says, verse 34. It says, then calling the crowds to join his disciples, Jesus said, if any of you want to be my followers, so this is so important. If any of you want to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. Jesus says, I'm going to go to the cross. Peter says, absolutely not. You can never do that. Jesus says, actually, Peter, if you want to follow me, you've got to go to a cross as well. If you want to be my follower, you must give up your own way, take up your cross, and follow me. If you try to hang on to your life, you will lose it. But if you give up your life for my sake and for the sake of the good news, you will save it. And what does it benefit you if you gain the whole world but lose your own soul? Is anything worth more than your soul? If anyone is ashamed of me and my message in these adulterous and sinful days, the Son of Man will be ashamed of that person when he returns in glory of his Father with the holy angels. Notice what Jesus says here to Peter. He says, Peter, actually, if you want to follow me, if you want to keep being my disciple, then it actually is going to require you to give up your own way and take up a cross of your own. What Jesus demanded for his followers then and what Jesus still demands of his followers today is for us to give up our own way and take up a cross. Think about a cross. A cross is not just like a piece of jewelry that we wear around our neck. It's not just a symbol that we get tattooed somewhere. A cross here in this context is literally an instrument of death. A cross is a way you die. What does Jesus say? Jesus says, take up your instrument of death to follow me. Like, this is radical. Well, what Jesus is saying that we have to die to ourselves in order to live for him. So do you notice how countercultural here the invitation of Jesus is? Jesus says, deny yourself, die to yourself, and follow me. What does our culture say? Our culture doesn't say deny yourself. Our culture says gratify yourself, satisfy yourself. In fact, our culture even takes it a step further. What our culture said is, hey, if you deny yourself, if you deny your needs, your wants, your desires, if you deny those things, you are never going to be happy because you will never be the true, authentic version of you. That's what our culture says. That's the message that is preached. You can't deny yourself because if you do, you will never truly live. Jesus says the exact opposite. Jesus says, no, actually, the only way to live, the only way to true life, the only way to eternal life, the only way to the life that I give is by denying yourself, by taking up your cross and following me. Listen, that's part of what this picture of baptism is. That's why we celebrate baptism so much around here. Like, I was like, Gavin, man, we're so excited and proud of you for what you've done, because part of the symbolic picture of baptism is that going into the water, part of what that represents is our old self dying. It represents us dying to our old self, and the coming up out of the water represents our new life in Christ. And so, hey, listen, if you're here today and you have begun following Jesus but haven't been baptized, man, let us just encourage you, like that's your next step. It is a powerful, important thing. But that's part of what that represents, the dying to ourselves to live and surrender to following Jesus. And you see, that's what Jesus is calling Peter to here. Peter had his own ideas of what it meant to follow Jesus. He had his own ideas of what it meant to follow the Messiah. And Jesus says, Peter, no, forget all that. I'm doing something completely different. Jesus says, Peter, if you want to follow me, you've got to die to all that. Die to all your expectations of what I was going to do and surrender yourself to follow me. Now, we're going to read the little next section as it transitions into chapter 9 in a minute. We're going to look at something that Jesus shows Peter right after this. But before we get to that, I want us to know how Peter's story in this life ended. And this isn't outside the Bible because this happened after the Bible. But what we know from history is about 30 years after this, about 30 years later from this exchange that Jesus and Peter has, a guy named Nero is the emperor of Rome. You've probably heard of Nero. He's like this crazy, maniacal emperor. At one point in his reign, Nero started to persecute and execute Christians. And one of the ways that he would execute Christians was by hanging them on a cross. And what history tells us is that as part of that, as one of the figureheads, as one of the leaders of the early church, Peter is arrested by Nero and he is executed on a cross. But here's what history tells us. When Peter was arrested and they brought him to his cross to execute him, Peter stopped them. And he said, hey, but before you do this, he said, I am not worthy to die in the same manner that my Lord did. I'm not worthy to die the same death that he did. So Peter looked at his executioners and he said, would you please, just as a last wish, would you crucify me upside down? Because I'm not worthy to die in the same manner as my Lord. And so what history tells us is Peter died on a cross being hung upside down. So, think about this. How does Peter go from rebuking Jesus, right, and saying, Jesus, you will never go to a cross. You can't do that. We're not going to let that happen. How does Jesus go from that to Jesus saying, actually, Peter, if you want to follow me, you've got to take up your own cross, to then eventually Peter literally going and giving his life on a cross as a martyr in faithfulness to Jesus? How does that happen? And I think the answer is pretty simple. Because again, remember, look at what Jesus said again in verse 33. When Peter rebukes Jesus, says, Jesus, you're not going to the cross. Jesus says, Peter, you're seeing things merely from a human point of view, not from God's point of view. And so I think how Peter went from that moment where he was rebuking Jesus, saying, no, Jesus, you'll never go to a cross, to him himself being willing to go to the cross. He began to see what Jesus really came to do, and he began to see from God's point of view. And I think that begins in this next story, right as it transitions into chapter 9. So let me read this, and then we'll wrap up. But right after this is what Mark records. It's a weird story, but lean in and check out what happens here. It says 6 days later, so within a week, right? Imagine, like, right, that roller coaster that Peter had been on where he goes from confessing that Jesus is the Messiah, Jesus saying, hey, you're no longer Simon, you're Peter, you're the rock, he's on that high, to Peter saying something that causes Jesus to look at him and say, get away from me, Satan. Peter's got to be so low right now. He's got to feel so down. He's got to think, does Jesus still love me? Does Jesus still have a plan for me? Is Jesus done with me yet? So Jesus doesn't even let a week pass before he shows Peter something amazing to reassure Peter. So 6 days later, Jesus took Peter and James and John and led them up a high mountain to be alone. As the men watched, Jesus' appearance was transformed, And his clothes became dazzling white, far whiter than any earthly bleach could ever make them. Then Elijah and Moses appeared and began talking with Jesus. So Jesus is kind of somehow gloriously transformed. His body physically begins to shine. And then Moses and Elijah, these dudes from thousands of years earlier, appear. Like, this is a crazy thing. Peter exclaimed, "Rabbi, it's wonderful for us to be here. Let us make 3 shelters as memorials, one for you, one for Moses, one for Elijah." I love this line. He said this because he didn't really know what else to say, for they were all terrified. Isn't that great? Right, like it's these 3 guys and Jesus all alone on a mountain. Suddenly, Jesus starts shining and 2 dead guys appear. And Peter's like, they're terrified. Peter doesn't know what to say. He feels like he has to say something. He's like, "Jesus, can we build some shelters for you, I guess? This is weird," but that's what happens. It says, "Then a cloud overshadowed them, and a voice from the cloud said, 'This is my dearly loved son, listen to him.' Suddenly, when they looked around, Moses and Elijah were gone, and they saw only Jesus with them. As they went back down the mountain, Jesus told them not to tell anyone what they had seen until the Son of Man had risen from the dead." Again, weird story, right? But what's going on is that Jesus, the Son of God, the eternal Son of God, during his time here on earth, he was still fully divine. When Jesus was born and came to earth, he never stopped being God. He never stopped being divine, but he also put on full humanity. So during his time on earth, that divinity, in a way, was clothed in humanity. It was veiled in humanity. It was kind of hidden in humanity. But at this encounter, what Peter and James and John see is Jesus shows them the full glory of who he is. For this moment, Jesus is physically transformed into what he will be after his resurrection. He is transformed to show Peter a glimpse, a picture of Jesus as the risen, victorious, resurrected king that he will be. What Jesus is showing Peter here is he's saying, "Peter, don't be so worried about the cross, because the cross will not be the end of me." Saying, "Peter, the cross will lead to victory. I will rise victorious from the grave." He's saying, "Peter, I didn't just come," amen. Saying, "Peter, I didn't just come to save my people from Rome. That'd be too small. Rome is small potatoes. Like, I could overthrow Rome with a snap of my fingers. That's not a big deal. I didn't come to save people from Rome. I came to save people eternally from sin and death. And so I want you to see this picture, this glimpse of me in my full glory, resurrected power, because this is a preview of what is going to come." That's what Peter is given the grace to be able to behold. And I believe after seeing a glimpse of that, after seeing what was going to happen in the future, seeing things from God's perspective, from that heavenly perspective, that Jesus would go to the cross and die, but he would rise victorious, defeating sin and death forever. I think when Peter was able to see a glimpse of that, it changed everything for him. So for us today, and I'll be honest, man, this isn't easy, but for us today, Jesus' invitation to Peter, it's the same invitation that he extends to us. The invitation to trust him by denying ourselves, taking up our cross, meaning dying to ourselves, and following him. But again, let's be real, right? Just like it was for Peter, it's so hard to do that, isn't it? It's so hard day to day to deny ourselves and take up our cross and follow Jesus. Right? It's hard to follow Jesus by forgiving others when they sin against us. It's hard to do that. We have to deny ourselves to do that. It's hard to follow Jesus and live generously like he calls us to, because we've got to deny ourselves to do that. It's hard to follow Jesus and seek sexual purity in a world where promiscuity is thrown in our faces all the time. It's hard to do that. We've got to deny ourselves at times to do that. Man, it's hard to follow Jesus and love your enemies and bless those who persecute you. We've got to deny ourselves in order to do that. And that's hard, but that's the calling. And so I think here through Peter's story, though, first we remember that when we fall short, when we blow it, God's grace and his mercy is there waiting for us. I love that this story of the transfiguration happens right after Peter blows it. Because again, Peter's at this spiritual low. He's fallen off the mountaintop head first. He's missed the whole point. Jesus has to rebuke him and call him, saying he's feeling so low. And immediately Jesus follows that up by showing him extravagant grace. So when we blow it, and we'll blow it, when we fail to deny ourselves and take up our cross, don't wallow in that. Don't think God's done with you. Don't think God has given up on you. Receive his grace because it's there waiting for you. But in that moment of the fight, when we're there in the fight, in those moments where we are trying hard to deny ourselves and follow Jesus, again, I think we see here how we need to shift our mind from earthly things and have that heavenly perspective. Right? That was Peter's problem at first. Jesus said, Peter, you're seeing things from a human perspective, not from God's. So in those moments, we've got to have God's perspective. We remember, like Peter was able to see, that Jesus is a risen, victorious King. And just like Peter was able to see Jesus glorified, we will see Jesus glorified when he returns. It's not some theoretical thing. It's not some kind of ethereal thing that may or may not happen. Jesus promises that he will physically return and we will see him. Not as some soulless, disembodied spirits, but as physical, resurrected people. We will see the risen Lord. He promises to return. And maybe tomorrow, maybe in 10 years, maybe in another 10,000 years, none of us have any clue. We don't know when it will happen, but he promises it will happen. He will return in glory, and just like Peter saw the glorified, resurrected King Jesus, we will see the glorified, resurrected King Jesus, and here's the deal. Man, when we meet him face to face, when we see him face to face, clothed in the full glory of the God that he is, then man, each and every moment of sacrifice, each and every moment of denying ourselves to take up our cross to follow him that we did in this life, all of those sacrifices will seem like nothing in light of the reward of receiving his grace and seeing him face to face and living with him forever.